and welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online publication where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. Joining me today is Professor Patrick Hosein. For many of you who studied at the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago, especially in the engineering, computer science, and IT departments over the past 20 or so years, you may have heard of Professor Hosein. And we plan to talk about his illustrious career in at least one future episode. However, today our focus is on the Trinidad and Tobago Network Information Center, TTNIC, for which Professor Hosein is the CEO. Prof, welcome.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks again for the invitation to do this podcast interview, and I look forward to answering whatever questions you may have.
Okay, great. So, Prof, the Trinidad and Tobago Network Information Center, TTNIC, registers and manages internet or website domains under the .tt country top-level domain. But can you give us a clearer sense of what that means, what TTNIC does?
Okay, so each country has something called a ccTLD, a country code top-level domain. So, for instance, in Jamaica, it will be .jm, Barbados.bb, and Trinidad, it is .tt. And there's an associated registry for registration of those domains. And TTNIC manages the registry for that, in the case of .tt. We've been doing it for like 25 years now.
Okay, yes, I noted that you all have been around for quite a while. And when I think back, I believe, when you started TTNIC, many Caribbean countries were not paying attention to country code top-level domain names at that time, but it appears you were. What was the environment like, and what was your own thinking at that time in order to set up and go through the trouble of setting up TTNIC?
Okay, so let me give you a little background on what happened. Back in the early 90s, around 91, I was working at doing research at Bell Labs, and then I decided to return home to Trinidad. Well, actually, I had to return because I was on a scholarship and I had to go back to serve some time. So when I returned to Trinidad, I was a lecturer at UE in the electrical engineering department. And in order to continue some of my research, I needed to keep contact with colleagues at Bell Labs, and which meant having internet access. And in those days, of course, there was no internet access in Trinidad. So the first thing I tried to do is to get some internet access for the university. And during that process, I got involved in domain name management, and I was assigned, in those days, the assignments for the domain administrator of a country was typically assigned to an academic. And in those early days, the process was very ad hoc, informal. And the person in charge, John Postel, because of my background, etc., he assigned me to become domain administrator for .tt. So I started being an administrator back in the early 90s, probably 91 or 92. In the first couple of years, we basically gave away domains for free because nobody knew what a domain was anyway, and so we had very few applications. But one thing I did do is initially all domains, top-level domains for the Caribbean countries, were managed by a university in Puerto Rico. And one of the first things I did was take control of that management, and we handled it ourselves in Trinidad. So that is a brief history of how I got involved in domain name administration and why I was assigned as the administrator for .tt. And related to this, I eventually was able to get internet access for the university in at least the St. Augustine campus, but it was just dial-up access, for a few hours per day, etc. So those were the early days, and I started doing the administration then, but I did leave the university around 95, and at that time the university felt that they weren't prepared to manage the .tt domain. So I continued doing it for the next, from that time onwards. I returned to Trinidad about 7 years ago. And so I'm now in the computer science department, but continuing doing the domain name administration for .tt. What we did, we started charging for domains probably around 95 or 96. And because we were now charging, and the reason for charging was because we were now getting sufficient domain applications, and we needed to have resources to run the servers at an acceptable level. So we started charging, and at that time we formed TTNIC, basically myself and one other director. Okay. So that basically is it. Yeah.
Okay, great. I guess there are a number of things that you've said that I want to touch on. But let me ask you, so what is the demand for .tt domain names like? Is it just limited to organizations or individuals based in Trinidad and Tobago?
No, from the start it was open internationally. In fact, most of our domains are international applications as opposed to national or Trinidad applications. And that's something we've been looking at changing. But the demand over the years, it peaked, several years ago. But with the introduction of new ccTLDs, like .google, etc., you have a lot more options for domain names. And so it has pretty much leveled out. And one of the things we have been thinking about is whether to change the business model to increase the number of applications by reducing prices, for instance. And I can talk more about that later on when we start talking about policy decisions, etc.
Okay.
Or I can get into it now if you want.
Sure. I guess let's touch on some of these business model issues, and then we can at least continue with some of the other policy questions that I might have.
Sure. So in the beginning, up until I would say about 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of the policies were developed by basically TTNIC itself. What we felt is that this should really be a multi-stakeholder decision. So TTNIC actually started to form what we call a TTMAG, which is the Trinidad and Tobago Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group. So we set up the initial board for that, interim board, I should say. It was not an official board. And that interim board then went on to formalize and form the official board for TTMAG. The task of TTMAG is, in addition to other internet-related issues, is to come up with policies and guidelines for management of .tt domains. So that takes the burden off my shoulders to making decisions for .tt domains.
All right. So I just now going back to you. You spoke about, I guess, luckily because of the position that Trinidad and Tobago took with respect to allowing the domain to be used internationally, the .tt domain name to be open for international use or for use by entities not based in Trinidad and Tobago. You seem to have been generating enough funds to at least sustain the operations of TTNIC. Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, from the start, TTNIC has been a very lean organization because initially it was, domains were offered for free. So I did it on a voluntary basis. And what I did over the first couple of years was to automate as many things as possible. So today, TTNIC is really run by essentially 2 part-time people, myself, and there's another person who handles some of the billing issues. So it's a lean human resource company because we automate as many things as we can. Now, there is one thing that people still complain about in terms of registration. We do have one manual process or function, which is we still manually inspect each domain name application. Now, let me explain why we do that. So, for instance, if you go to GoDaddy, you could put in whatever name you want, .com or whatever, and as long as it's available, you will be able to get it. And you can pay for it immediately and you're online immediately. For country codes, we believe that we need to be a little bit more careful. And this is why we want to inspect the domain names themselves. So, for instance, if, for instance, somebody, let's take politician X. If somebody applies for something like politician X is a moron.tt, and we get that, I would then query what is the reason for applying for this, etc. Whereas if they did it at GoDaddy, it would automatically be accepted. And, we could get into some serious issues if we allowed certain domain names. So that's why we still have that manual step. But besides that, everything else is automated.
Okay. So as you had mentioned, because there are only two of you part-time working, I guess the actual registration and management of the registry is automated for the most part and mainly administrative. So I think you began to touch on it when you spoke about the TTMAG. But how has the role of TTNIC itself evolved over the years since it was established?
Well, again, in the first few years, 20 years or so, it was basically everything was run by TTNIC, even the policies we used. And of course, these policies were based on best practices of other ccTLDs. But certain things we needed to make on our decisions on our own. But after the formation of TTMAG, they basically would handle policy decisions. And so, for instance, a couple of things they've done recently is TTNIC provides free hosting and domain names for all schools within Trinidad and Tobago. So we needed to come up with some more rigorous guidelines for who is eligible. And so TTMAG came up with those guidelines and sent it to us, and we approved it, and we now follow those. Similarly, for charitable organizations, they've come up with some guidelines for us to approve charitable organizations and give them free domain names. So again, those decisions are now made by them. And if we get questionable domain name applications like that, that example I just gave about politician X is a moron.tt, I would then pass it up to them for their approval or rejection. So they now make those types of decisions for .tt.
Okay. I also just want to touch on the fact that I still note, and I think that there is a bit of a spectrum in terms of how countries see the ccTLD. Some see it as some sort of, I guess, commercial product that they can sell worldwide and, use it to generate considerable revenue. You have like .tv, which is for the country of Tuvalu, but is used a lot and is sold a lot to, I think, the film and movie industry. You have, I think, .ag, which is, I think, the extension for Antigua and Barbuda. And, I think it seems to be something that the German business companies tend to like as well. But what do you think about whether or not countries could or should commercialize the ccTLD versus thinking of it as a national resource that has to be carefully controlled?
Well, our focus has been trying to encourage local companies and organizations to use .tt. But still, some organizations and companies still prefer to go with .com domains because the impression is that it's a more global name. So one thing we have been doing is trying to encourage local companies. And one thing we do as well is we actually use the income from international registrations to subsidize what we do for local companies. So the cost of domains for local organizations and companies is half that of international companies. So some of the things we are trying to do, for instance, is provide a free domain name to each registered company within Trinidad and Tobago. And again, the TTMAG is working on coming up on guidelines for doing that because, the question is how do you verify that it's a legitimate local organization, etc. So yes, our focus is on using .tt to develop internet within the country. But we also felt that international companies should be allowed to register. So, for instance, Google uses google.tt. So when you type in Google in Trinidad, you'll be redirected to google.tt. And of course, you still have access to the same functionality as google.com. But they use that to separate the country codes. So to answer your question, our focus is Trinidad companies, Trinidad and Tobago companies and organizations, and we are trying to find ways to encourage them to use .tt. As I said before, one complaint that people tend to have is the fact that they cannot get it instantly as GoDaddy. And that's what we have to educate people as to why our process is a little bit different to GoDaddy. It's not so much the price, but the fact that they still have to wait, when until I approve it. Now, if I'm at my computer, I approve it immediately. But, I'm not on my computer 24 hours a day. And so there sometimes are some delays. So, we need to educate people as to the value of using .tt, etc.
Okay. And just to touch on the whole issue of the companies or organizations like using the .com, but sometimes they like to insert the 2-letter geographic codes in their domain names. So sometimes you may find a company may have companyx.tt.com. And I know that this is something that is being debated globally, for example, at ICANN. But do you have any thoughts about it, and why is this an issue that ccTLD registries are concerned about?
Okay, well, in Trinidad, what they tend to use is more something like company name tt.com. They don't use company name .tt.com because that would mean having to register within the domain tt.com. So what we've been doing, or as part of this process of offering at least one free domain to local companies, is to identify those that have been using name tt.com and give them some incentive to switch to using .tt. Now, with respect to the issue of using the country code.com or even a country code another country code, so for instance, jm.tt, where JM is the country code for Jamaica. Now, that has been under discussion, and the problem is it's difficult. So for instance, if we do get an application like that, we would query why they would want to use it. So if there's a legitimate reason for them to use JM, for instance, JM might be the acronym for their company, then we allow it. But of course, different countries do different things based on whether or not it's a country code or not.
Definitely. That's certainly the case. So I also want to just touch on the whole issue of the disaster resilience and recovery. As we all know, first, particularly in the Caribbean, the hurricane season last year, 2017, was quite devastating to a lot of countries. And I want to know whether or not TTNIC and probably its associated structures and partners, have you all considered the whole issue of disaster resilience, recovery, business continuity, and whether or not you all have any policies or systems in place to address that?
Okay, so with respect to disaster recovery within Trinidad, well, first of all, we host our name servers, which are the servers that keep the records for .tt. Those are all outside of Trinidad. In fact, we have 4 different name servers from 4 different organizations. And each of those have something called anycast, which means they have multiple servers, etc. So it's a robust registration. But the issue is what happens if Trinidad becomes isolated? How would you be able to resolve .tt names? And so we have been in discussions with the local IXP to include a name server, something called a secondary name server in Trinidad, so that if we do get isolated, that name server would be able to continue resolving .tt names. But that is only a partial solution, because the real issue is what happens to all those other local servers within Trinidad with non.tt domains. So if you have a company within Trinidad with a .com address, if Trinidad, for instance, gets isolated from the internet, there's no way to resolve that .com name to an IP address and be able to route internally within Trinidad. So the IXP would allow you to route stuff internally, even if we were disconnected from the outside world. But without having those .com names, you wouldn't be able to do it. So actually, a colleague of mine, Kim Malaleo, had asked me to look into that, and both of us are working on a solution where we would cache or store mappings from host names to local IP addresses. And once we have that store of mappings, we could use those mappings in the case of loss of connectivity to the outside world. So to answer your question, .tt is well protected if there are issues within Trinidad. And we could also assist with resolution of .tt names within Trinidad by including a name server in the IXP. But the major problem is the non.tt domains. And as I said, we're working on a solution for that. But it's not part of TTNIC. It's part of just my general research.
Okay. Yeah, because clearly, this is a risk that people, need to appreciate, that especially if a lot of your business is local, but you're using a .com, .net, or what might be a ccTLD, that unless those addresses can be resolved or routed appropriately, understood and routed appropriately by the internet infrastructure that we use, then if for whatever reason your country is not able to connect to those servers, many of which are located outside of the region, then people will be able to access your domain and therefore your platform.
So, and just to continue that, so we have a simple solution to that scenario, but the issue tends to be we cannot get data from ISPs, for instance, to show proof of concept of the approach. Basically what we would have to do is get an ISP to provide us with simply mappings from host names to local IP addresses. And you can find out for each country what are their local IP addresses. So we would just need that mapping, and all we would need to do is store that mapping so that it could be used to resolve local names or names to local IP addresses in the case of disconnection.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think I'm getting to my last set of questions. I also just wanted to touch on another issue that is being debated, globally, which is the whole use of emoji in top-level domain names. And again, what were your thoughts on that issue? And, whether TTNIC might be considering allowing, or does TTNIC allow emojis to be used in the domain names?
At present, we don't, but we are very flexible, and as soon as it becomes best practice, we will include it as well. So, and our feeling is to be as open or as flexible as possible. So from the beginning, we, for instance, offered 2-letter domain names, and now we even offer single-letter domain names. We also offer IDNs, international domain names. So, for instance, we have a lot of applications from China, for instance, where they apply for some Chinese characters .tt or Chinese characters .co.tt. In fact, they are probably one of our biggest customers right now. So we do support IDNs, international domain names. So if at some point countries are going to start accepting emojis, we will also do that, and it should be relatively easy for us to include that in our registration process.
Okay, Prof. So in an earlier part of our discussion, you had mentioned TTMAG and therefore the evolving role of TTNIC in the whole internet community and I guess governance community within Trinidad and Tobago. Are there any other initiatives that TTNIC might be a part of, although it might not be leading it, but probably a keen supporter of?
Okay, so TTNIC has several initiatives, and again, to support the local population in with respect to the internet. For instance, we have something called TT Lab, or we support a group of researchers called TT Lab, and the URL is lab.tt. And this is a group of researchers supervised by me, where we cover lots of different technical areas, from machine learning to optimization to wireless communications, etc. TTNIC provides some scholarships to some of those students. Sometimes we provide, in fact, we provide travel grants for each student per year to attend a conference, to present a paper. And we provide some other assistance as well to users like server resources, etc. In addition, I mentioned before TTMAG, which could be found on mag.tt, which is a policy decision group. There's edu.tt. So what TTNIC does as well is we provide free hosting and domain names to all educational institutions in Trinidad, from pre-care up to tertiary. And so any school could go to edu.tt and apply for a domain name. And if they need to be hosted as well, we would provide resources for that. We've also been involved in open data initiatives. So we provided a platform called data.tt, where people could upload open data. There's a corresponding platform called maps.tt, which is used for spatial data. And I believe that that's about it. We provide other support to the local communities as well in terms of assisting organizations like the Trinidad and Tobago Computer Society and the Internet Society of Trinidad and Tobago and the IEEE of Trinidad and Tobago. We provide assistance in terms of event sponsorship, etc.
Oh, that's excellent. I mean, based on all of these things, I think what is really coming home to me is how it sounds terrible, but how lucrative TTNIC has been from the perspective that it has been able to infuse resources into a number of initiatives that ultimately help to foster in the internet and internet use, and I guess use of the .tt domain, but also just initiatives and programs that ultimately help to boost internet use, adoption, the resources that are available online. So, I'm thinking, I'm just kind of wondering whether or not many of our other countries in the region do so. I know that some countries have or do sell their ccTLD, their country code extension, as on a commercial basis, but I don't know whether or not they seem to be as effective as TTNIC has been.
Well, and I have been encouraging, the other islands to, instead of outsourcing, to run the registry in-house in Ireland, because we can help them. For instance, the software I developed back in the early 90s to run the registry. And actually, the reason I had to develop my own software is because in the early 90s, there was no registry software. So I developed my own software. And recently, for instance, Bahamas evaluated different registry software, and they found ours was the most appropriate for their environment. And so we actually installed our registry software for .bs, which is Bahamas. So the thing is, you could run a registry with relatively a small number of personnel or people, and have sufficient profit to assist the local community, which is what we try to do. Whatever profit we have, we try to feed it back into the community in various ways, in particular helping students with more advanced technology. So like right now with TT Lab, we focus a lot on AI and machine learning and data analytics, etc. So yes, I believe other countries could do the same, and I've been encouraging some of them. But first, they need to stop outsourcing the management of their domain.
Absolutely. And as you said, if two of you can do it on a part-time basis, I'm sure that they can probably allocate some resources to do so as well, or similar resources to do so as well. Okay, Prof, I think that's me done today. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you. And, as I did say in my introduction, I would hope to set up another conversation with you, because you seem to have done quite a bit in the electrical engineering, computing, and IT space that we definitely have to touch on. And certainly by your long-standing involvement in education and academia, I would certainly like to pick your brain as to what you think about what's going on at the university level in those fields, as well as with respect to just ICT and technology within the region.
Sure. And again, thank you for the invitation. And I do look forward to, I have strong opinions on several ICT issues within the region, especially on what we invest in. So yes, when we get to that, I could give you some of my opinions, which is a bit in contradiction to what other people have been doing, but we could discuss that at a later date.
Great. Thanks again.
Well, thank you for having me.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.